Shalom, I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz. I'm the Rabbi of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia, speaking to you from the pulpit of the congregation. At this time, I'd like to speak to you on the subject of what the Nazirite can say to us today. The Bible speaks to us from a world that is different in some respects, and yet, since human nature is constant, its messages to us are quite apt once we know how to translate from the different social and political conditions of the Bible's day and age to those of our own. In the course of its discussion of the blueprint for Israelite society, the Bible describes the institution of Nazir, which is rendered in English as Nazirite. The basic text is Numbers, Book of Numbers, chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. The first part of the text describes the restrictions under which the Nazirite lives. No consumption of alcohol, no coming into contact with a corpse, and no cutting of his hair. Then there is a legal section dealing with the rituals that the Nazirite must follow if he or she has accidentally broken the vow and come into contact with a corpse. The text concludes with a description of the sacrifice that the Nazirite brings upon completion of his or her term of consecration. The text leaves us puzzled, however, as to just what the institution of Nazirite meant, emotionally or psychologically, to its biblical first audience. What impresses me about the institution is that it is voluntary. The opening sentences of the passage make it clear, quote, "Man or woman, should anyone act exceptionally to make a Nazirite vow to keep himself apart for the Lord." Numbers chapter 6, verse 2. This verse ought to impress us. Perhaps on first reading it does not seem so striking, but that is because we live in a world where people commonly strive for a religious calling or status because they feel prompted to do so. In Judaism, rabbis are selected from among the ranks of those who wish to take up that calling. But that was not the reality of the biblical world. Consider who was a religious leader in biblical Israel. Priests, Kohanim, were a dynasty. In the world portrayed by the bulk of biblical texts, the priest was a male descendant of Aharon, Aaron, the first priest. Full disclosure, there is one passage, Book of Judges, chapter 17, where a certain man named Micha appointed his son as a priest for the family. But the Bible condemns that as a sign of the anarchy when proper instruction and proper order did not exist in the wild days of early Israel. In general, one became a Kohen by birth, not by choice. Other than the Kohen or priest, the religious leader known in biblical Israel is the Navi, the prophet. The Bible makes it clear that a true prophet is one singled out by God, not by self-selection. In fact, many of the greatest prophets of the Bible, Moses, Jeremiah, Amos, are described as having been initially unwilling to take up the mantle of prophecy. As Jeremiah expressed it, he did not wish to prophesy, but he could not do otherwise because of the strength of his inner compulsion to speak the words God instructed him to speak. To some degree, the kings of Judah and Israel also claimed a religious status, but again, they were limited by dynastic constraints. In some, the Bible did not have any equivalent of the modern situation where a person decides to take up a religious vocation, except for the Nazirite. I urge us not to lose sight of that basic fact in the welter of biblical verses about the ritual restrictions upon the contact of the Nazirite with the destabilizing physical conditions of life. And as for the not cutting of hair, we can understand that as an advertisement to all who would come into contact with the Nazirite that this was a person self-consecrated to God. We know that from the otherwise enigmatic opening verse of the Song of Deborah, Judges chapter 5, verse 2. Bifroa peraot beYisrael behitnadev am barchu Adonai. When locks go untrimmed in Israel, when people dedicate themselves, bless God. Today, the Western world is very much about the individual pursuit of happiness. The biblical caveat to that is twofold. First, happiness, as the Bible understands it, is not a zero-sum game with my happiness coming at the expense of your happiness. The covenanted life in which individuals compose a people and the entire people are in a relationship with God, that is the framework that the Bible recognizes as the appropriate way to conduct a life. And second, the Bible knows much less freedom to pursue one's individual happiness than the social revolutions of the past 2.5 centuries have wrought. Nonetheless, the institution of the Nazirite tells us that this desire to hear an inner voice prompting us to God's service is not a mere concession to the fashions of our age. If the Bible, for all of its more tightly constrained social possibilities, could envision the Nazirite, and moreover, if in the Bible with its rigid gender roles, a woman as well as a man could take on the vow of the Nazirite, then certainly that can be an inspiration for our time as well. May we find ways to harmonize the inner promptings of our hearts with our awareness of what God our Maker holds present as the best path in life for us to walk. Amen.